to make sure that I can do a proper keynote talk for you because this is going to be a bit of a bonkers 45 minutes. So what I'm going to recommend, hopefully you've got a tea or a coffee or a nice beverage, like sit back and let some of it wash over you. And maybe some of it will like collect and be interesting. And if it's too many facts and random things that I'm going to throw at you based on my own personal hyperfixation, don't worry, there will not be a pop quiz at the end. But there will be a Q&A, and it would be really, really lovely if you could come up with the questions. If you put one in the chat, it would be lovely to have a little chat afterwards. It's really nice to get your feedback and thoughts on the things that I'm going to be talking about. If you're wondering who the hell I am and what's going on here, hopefully I can elucidate a little bit. So bear with me one moment. Hopefully, I should be allowed to share my screen. Let me just make sure that works. The joys of the internet. There we go. Cool, cool, cool. There we go. Hopefully, you can now all see the slides. So, this talk is going to be called Monsters in the Closet. And I'll explain a little bit about who I am, why I'm talking to you today, and about my area of research and fascination. And hopefully, you'll find some of it interesting as well. So, the basic premise is we're going to be talking a bit about lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans history, but through a very specific lens. So, I'm a queer historian. But my particular interest is around folklore and mythology. And through that lens, I tend to look a lot at the ways in which monsters and creatures and mythical animals are represented and how they connect, or how I believe they connect with LGBTQ plus people, which has led me to like a lot of very strange places. So today, what I'm going to do is give you like a really short 45-minute précis, throw a lot of stuff at you, and hopefully we can have a fun little chat at the end. So my name is Sacha Coward. My pronouns are he, him. I've been working in the museum sector for about 15 years now. And I have just written my first book, which is called Queer as Folklore, which is where a lot of this is coming from. But in terms of my job, I've done all kinds of things. I do a lot of stuff with young people. I work with galleries. I work with libraries. And it's worth saying as a starter that my book partly exists because of the wonderful space that is libraries. I find it really difficult to write and work from home. So I need to always get out and find a space where I can write and do my research. Ideally, coffee shops are great, but they're expensive and you end up imbibing a lot of caffeine. So libraries have been a really important space. So my local library is Stroud Public Library, and I've actually thanked them in my book. So that's kind of part of the connection to what we're going to be talking about today. I promise this isn't just me trying to sell you a book. But I am literally obliged by my publisher to do at least one horrible capitalism slide where I say, look at my shiny book, isn't it shiny? This is my shiny book. It is called Queer as Folklore. It's now out in paperback. But I promise that's the last time I'm going to try and sell that to you. So, what was the birth of queer as folklore? So, if we can rewind back to 2020, if we can imagine the space that we were in during lockdown, some very strange spaces, both psychological and physical, locked in our houses, often kind of left to our own devices. And a few thoughts that I've been having a long time as a queer person. And when I say queer, I mean part of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community. Um, I have become obsessed with the idea that there was a link between mermaids and unicorns. This was like my starting point, and what it is to be queer, and more than just they're shiny and glittery and fabulous. That's the surface level stuff. Why do queer people love mermaids and unicorns? The starting thing is because of the glitter. But I felt that there was something a bit more going on. And as a historian, someone that was working at the National Maritime Museum at this point, I kind of wanted to pull on a few strands. So this image here, this expresses what it was like to be my husband coming back from Tesco's and walking into the lockdown household. And this is how you would find me without the cigarette, luckily. But basically looking insane, trying to put connections between mythical creatures and queerness. And the end result of that research was Queer as Folklore. So if you're wondering what I'm on about, if you're not part of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans community, Or maybe you are, but you're still feeling a little confused. Maybe you've got some friends who are queer, maybe you don't. Let me just lay out the scene of how things are today and why this is an interesting area of research for me. If you go to any queer pride parade in the world, so London, if you go to New York, San Francisco, Tokyo, Sydney, Paris, you name it, you are going to see a lot of things. Like, obviously, you're going to see a lot of tank tops, a lot of sparkle, lots of rainbow flags, but you're also going to see mermaids and tridents and fairy wings and unicorn t-shirts. As a community, as a person that's part of this community, just believe me when I say we are obsessed with mythological symbols, creatures, and tropes. From the icons that we bedeck ourselves with, the tattoos we get, the words that we use to describe ourselves. So some of them have historically been slurs like fairy, but even terms like bear and wolf that are used within the gay community have this fairy tale vibe going on. In terms of our pop music, our drag performances, cosplay, activism, all of this often draws on symbols of demons and fairies and pixies and werewolves. All of these symbols seem to abound. So that's kind of the starting point. That's where we are today. And the fascination for me is where does this come from? So there's a few things. We spoke about the sparkle and the glitter, and apologies, I have a kitten in the background who very much wants to be part of this call. His name's Mikey, short for Michelangelo, and I'm sure he'll make an appearance a little bit later. But the other big thing that I think the obvious connection between us and mythical creatures and monsters is around otherness, right? So this is based on the idea that throughout history, and sadly still today, LGBTQ plus people have been seen and described as not being quite human, as being different. And these are some articles. Now, a number of these are pretty old, but not as old as you might think. So the Daily Mail article saying abortion hope after gay genes findings, that was just 1993. So it's within a lot of our lifetimes. I'd shoot my son if he had AIDS. Homo nest raided. Queen bees are stinging mad. These articles, it feels like we're describing an alien or a vampire, something that comes out at night, something that preys on other people, something that may take over or possess your children. And sadly, I can say that the rhetoric hasn't changed all that much. We still see this popping up all over the place. So that's another really obvious thing. But I want to go even deeper. So otherness and glitter and sparkle are clearly there. But I want to go into who created these myths and legends, these stories, and how have those been queered over time. That's my deeper fascination. Now, I promise you, I'm not just going to read you a massive wall of text throughout this talk. Most of it's lovely pictures to look at, but this is beautiful, and I need to read it to you. So this is by Susan Stryker. She's a trans woman, historian, and critic, and she wrote this piece in response to Frankenstein's monster. So it's like a queer person using literature to understand themselves. Hearken unto me, fellow creatures. I who have dwelt in a form unmatched with my desire. I whose flesh has become an assemblage of incongruous anatomical parts. I who achieve the similitude of a natural body only through an unnatural process. I offer you this warning. The nature you bedevil me with is a lie. Do not trust it to protect you from what I represent, for it is a fabrication of that cloaks the groundlessness of the privilege you seek to maintain for yourself at my expense. You are as constructed as me. The same anarchic womb has birthed us both. I call upon you to investigate your nature as I've been compelled to confront mine. I challenge you to risk abjection and flourish as well as I. So I know that's very dramatic for lunchtime, right? Summoning and wombs and anarchicness. But the idea being that, like, through the Frankenstein's monster, some people in the trans community can see a sense of empathy of, my body has been changed. I am seen as transformed. I am seen as different. But then reflect out to basically anyone, even if you're not part of the LGBTQ plus community, aren't we all a little bit monstrous if you get down to it? So I thought it's a beautiful piece to explore. So today, in this talk, we're going to be jumping through a bunch of different mythical creatures and archetypes, and I'll be sharing a little bit of my research because obviously capitalism, I still want you to buy my book. But we'll be doing mermaids for a bit. This was probably my gateway drug to folklore and mythology. We'll be talking about vampires. We'll be touching on aliens, which you may not think of as mythology, but I'll try and convince you otherwise, and robots. which is just a little tiny sprinkle, but it's a great big chapter. There's a huge amount of stuff about witchcraft, but we'll just do a little taster today. So let's start with mermaids. So the mermaid is a fascinating creature. Now, there are mermaids around the world. They're not all called mermaids. Colonialism has kind of smashed them all together under the European term mermaid, but they all have their own backstories. So the ones shown here, so there is a Ningyo on the far left. This is a indigenous Australian or Aboriginal mermaid. Sorry, York on the far left, my bad, is an indigenous Australian mermaid like creatures. So they're often hideous and they have these horrible voices, which is why they're known as Yorks. They can tempt and trick children. Or sometimes they're benevolent and they're the daughters or the handmaidens of the rainbow serpent, like a great divine entity. In the middle, we have Mami Wata. So Mami Wata is a West African deity that often is associated with serpents. So you can see like a serpentine form there, but also mermaid-like with a fish tail and a mirror. So there's a kind of sense of elemental power in these creatures, and they've become more and more mermaid-like as they've kind of been subsumed into kind of Western or European culture. Note though, in this one, the two faces. One of them is more masculine, one of them is more feminine, and also I know it's only lunchtime, but note the phallus as well. They're not just serpents, there's something more suggestive going on. And apologies, the one on the right is the Ningyo. So the Ningyo there is a traditional Japanese mermaid-like creature. Again, so it gives you a sense of the variety of mermaids. They don't all look like Disney's Ariel, although we will come to that later. But if you look at the mermaid as a creature, fish, human, aquatic, mythical beings, they often have this sense of gender bending, body transformation, sexuality wrapped into it. So it seems like this is not just something that is like white Western mermaids. This is something much richer than that. And as a fun example, this is an example of an ancient mermaid-like being. On the left, I know she may not look like a mermaid at first, but if you follow her body down to where the two bulls are, the animals, you'll see she's actually got like a sardine-like tail. So she's like a sardine mermaid. This is the goddess Atargatis, who is an ancient Syrian goddess. She was often associated by the Romans and the Greeks with the likes of Aphrodite and Venus, so a love goddess, although she has her own incredible backstory. She's sometimes, as you can see the image in the top right, shown as a mermaid with legs and a tail, and she was known collectively by non-Syrians as the Syrian goddess. That's how famous she was. Some stories say that she was a woman who fell in love with a married man and then in shame threw herself into the sea, but was transformed into a mermaid by the gods and into a goddess herself. She's a protector goddess, and in some ways, because of her backstory, she's associated with forbidden love, which I think is a really interesting twist on the Aphrodite myth. But the reason I want to get into her is she's an ancient mermaid. She codifies a lot of the later symbols of mermaid-like creatures in the West. She was famous at the time. And her priestesses, as you can see depicted in the middle there, sadly, she's had her nose knocked off, but she was pretty beautiful beforehand, I'm sure. So our priestesses would wear long flowing robes, they would hold rattles, they would dance, they could see the future, and they were able to bathe in the sacred pools of Atargatis. And they were also assigned male at birth. So these would be people who, when they were born, may have been described as boys, and then early on in their childhood and puberty, they would offer themselves to the goddess Atargatis as a symbol of their devotion. They would self-castrate and then live the rest of their lives ostensibly as a kind of women. Now, not all sources describe them respectfully. Sometimes they're called beggar priests or eunuch or castrati, but they're also called beautiful perfumed priestesses as well. So you have, yeah, even then, these different descriptions. But the mermaid is even here, like thousands of years ago, associated with body transformation and a sense of magic and religious ritual. The bottom image down here, now I'm really cautious using this word because I'm not of Indian descent, and I've been told that it has ambiguous meaning. The term I was taught was Hishra, but there may be other terms that are more respectful. These are people living in India who basically either may be intersex, many are assigned male at birth, and then basically live and define as women. And these people have been written about all the way going back to ancient Islamic texts. So they've been around for a very long time. They've been suppressed, particularly during European colonialism. But these are, I guess, the closest living synonym that we might have to the priestesses of Atargatis, and people like them have existed since the dawn of time. But fluidity and gender transformation associated with the mermaid is fascinating. Now, here's one of my new favorite people. So Hans Christian Andersen, who's depicted on the right. We've probably, a lot of us have heard about him. We know about his fame in writing some of the most celebrated fairy tales of all time: The Ugly Duckling, The Little Match Girl, and The Little Mermaid. But maybe you don't know the full story in terms of his love life and his sexuality, which is why I'm drawn to him. He wrote extensively about loving men and women, and depending on who you read, it feels that his love was always passionate and it was rarely ever reciprocated. He's quite a tragic character in some ways. He seems to write these beautiful, adoring love letters to men and women and never seems to receive quite the thing that he wanted in return. So he was known for writing a number of letters to the man on the left there, Edvard Cullen, who's rather hunky dude, I think. I can understand Howard Hans's interest there. He wrote, "I long for you as though you were a beautiful Calabrian girl. My sentiments for you are those of a woman. The femininity of my nature and our friendship must remain a mystery." It's not subtle. Like, he is very expressive in his diaries and letters about his lusts and loves. This is a bisexual man. He probably would never have used that term. In fact, we know that he didn't, but ostensibly this is someone that was attracted across the gender spectrum. But this relationship with Howard was very powerful. With Edvard was very, very powerful. And Edvard never really reciprocated, in fact, married a woman, still maintaining a friendship with Hans, but Hans was devastated. And it's at this point, in a moment of rejection, when Hans writes The Little Mermaid. And we know from his own words that Hans says, "I have never made up a character. Every character in my book I've met, even the ugly duckling, all of these creatures and beings, they're based on people in my life." So when he's writing the original Little Mermaid, arguably the most famous mermaid story of all time, at least as a white boy living in London, it's the one that I grew up with. That this is a self-insert, that Hans is dealing with his own loss of, a love, and he does this by writing this half-formed character who wants to escape the world that she's in to be with a prince. Now, in the original story, she doesn't get the prince in the end. She's turned into sea foam. Sorry, spoilers for a hundreds of year old story. It's a beautiful story, but I'll read you just a couple of quotes. "But a mermaid has no tears, and therefore she suffers so much more. Never had she danced so beautifully. The sharp knives cut her feet, but she did not feel it, for the pain in her heart was far greater." And finally, "Now he is certainly sailing above, he on whom my wishes hang, and in whose hand I should like to lay my life's happiness. I will dare everything to win him and an immortal soul. A cursed creature that loses her soul for love. A creature that isn't like the people she's trying to fit in with. A creature who can't cry publicly." I mean, the queer illusions are so powerful and so solid that I would call The Little Mermaid one of the greatest love letters never sent. And that's my argument anyway. This piece, and it's not just men, it's not just trans folk, it is also queer women as well, queer cis women. This piece here is by the artist Evelyn de Morgan. It hangs in Greenwich. You can go and see it for free at the Queen's House. Beautiful. It's called The Sea Maidens. And she based this on the story by Hans Christian Andersen. So even though it was a children's story, already it's resonating with queer folk. So she paints this painting of these are the sisters of Ariel coming to the surface to peer out at the human world. And if you look at their faces, you'll see they all have the same face and the same bored expression, as if like you've wandered in on them in a secret moment that you're not meant to be there for. So this is the face of Jane Hales. So Jane Hales, who's depicted up in the left-hand corner with the red hair, was a muse for Evelyn. She painted her obsessively over and over again. And from her painting paintings that were exhibited as part of the Queer British Artists exhibition at the Tate Britain, we know that Evelyn had, an erotic connection with men and with women. And we know, for example, if we look at their burial, we can see that Evelyn is buried next to her husband. She was married, but also next to Jane as well. And there's this not quite a menage a trois, but there is a complex story that is interwoven in the way that she would paint women, the way she would paint the female form, and using the mermaid from a children's story to encapsulate that desire. Fast forwarding, the most famous version of this story, the one that sadly I saw this before I was ever able to read the original Hans Christian Andersen, is the Disney story. But even there, I think I went through a phase as a teenager where I thought, oh, you've got to read the original because Disney's rubbish. They've taken all the good, dirty, nasty bits out. They've sanitized it. They've made her a pretty princess, and I still think that's not entirely inaccurate. But let's honor the role of the creators that made the Disney film. So Howard Ashman, who's depicted there, was one of him and Alan Menken worked on creating the script, the writing, and the music, and the entire story for the adaptation of The Little Mermaid. And we know for a fact that Howard was gay, and he was a writer for musical theatre. Around the same time he was writing Little Mermaid, he was writing a song called Sheridan Square, and there's just a few little lines there. And if it ended before it started, well, no one told us that life is fair, and why is it still so quiet tonight on Sheridan Square? And Sheridan Square is a place in New York that was known for where gay men would hang out, and this is during the HIV crisis of the 80s. So he's writing about losing his friends. He's watching his friends and lovers, young men, dropping around him whilst working on The Little Mermaid for Disney. Heartbreak in a different way, coming from Hans Christian Andersen through the lens of Howard Ashman. We get the Disney film, and he leaves his imprint on it. So the witch, the sea witch Ursula, is barely described in the original story. We don't know exactly what she looks like. And Disney wanted to make her a haggard old crone. But Howard, using his experience in the drag community, wanted to have it inspired by the 70s drag queen Divine. And you can see the two images side by side. So Ursula the Sea Witch is based on a drag queen. That's why when we start, she's putting her makeup on in the mirror. She's gyrating. She's using, quote, body language. There's a whole vibe going on there that is very intentional. And Howard worked on a number of Disney films. Tragically, towards the end of working on The Little Mermaid, he himself contracted HIV, and this is before there were the treatments that there are today. And he slowly watched his body decay. Whilst working on Beauty and the Beast, he inserted the symbol of the flower that slowly falls apart, the rose petals, people argue based on his own decay of his own body, right? And there's a lot of themes in that film that may just seem saccharine and sweet at first about your body, about being in the wrong body, about change, being trapped in the body that may die. And the end of this, Disney acknowledged after he sadly passed away in 1991, to our friend Howard, who gave a mermaid her voice and a beast his soul. We will be forever grateful, Howard Ashman. Now, I'm just picking out a few, by the way. There are so many examples of mermaid stories. Oscar Wilde rewrote The Little Mermaid. Sappho of Lesbos, where we get the word lesbian, was associated with mermaids, 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 mermaids. You can tell where my obsession came from. But I want to show the power of mermaids here. So moving on from Howard to the National AIDS Memorial, huge quilt that has been made where each of these squares reference different stories or connections to to people who passed away of HIV. But the number of which reference fairy tales and Disney and mermaids. Now, if you have LGBT friends, despite Disney not always being, or often not being, the best ally to our community, we are probably one of the biggest consumers, adult consumers of their content, and we have a connection with that escapism and mythology. That means that we commemorate that even in something as grave as a symbol relating to those that have died of HIV. So it's a powerful symbol. There you go. On the left is Sappho of Lesbos, Didn't expect to see that at lunchtime, did you? I won't need to describe that for you, but she's having a good time. And in the background, we have a bunch of mermaids frolicking because one of the stories was that Sappho may have taken her life at sea, and therefore she's often depicted as a mermaid-like creature. On the right there, in the same album, same annual that Sherlock Holmes was originally written in, we have in Mrs. Beeton's Christmas annual, we have an image of two female mermaids kissing at Christmas under mistletoe. So these things are coded over and over again through tragedy and beauty and strife and wonder. The mermaid is almost a secondary rainbow flag for us. Jumping through to the 1930s in Berlin, and I warn you, this story gets dark. Apologies. A lot of queer history has a dark side to it. But this is a photo of the Institute for Sexualwissenschaft. Means basically the Institute for Sexology, or the study of sex, in Berlin. The man on the bottom right with the wonderful walrus moustache, who sat there next to Medusa, the woman with the Medusa headpiece, is Magnus Hirschfeld. And he founded this, and this was a safe space for queer people. They use different terms. They would have probably described themselves as inverts or androgynes. But across the LGBTQ plus spectrum, you can see them here. We have gender non-conforming people. We have people who have same-sex desire. We have people who are the equivalent of non-binary folk, people who were actually seeking to have hormones in their bodies changed so that they could feel more comfortable. And sadly, their collection of books was destroyed by the Nazis, but we have a list of all the books that were destroyed, and amongst it, fairy tales, mermaid stories, a story called The Lorelei. These adult queer folk from the past were reading the same books that we and me are obsessed with today. This frivolous creature that means so much more. Fast forwarding again to today, the biggest transgender youth support network in the UK, it's called Mermaids. And that's not a coincidence. Young queer folk, young trans folk often identify with the mermaid because she or he can transform their body. Their gender is not based on what is going on beneath the waist because they all have fishtails. So it's a safe space, maybe, for young people to explore gender and sexuality. So that's mermaids. What about vampires? Well, Vampire, for a bit of fun here, this is an image of the Boulet brothers. If you have ever seen RuPaul's Drag Race and you get a bit sick of it, I could recommend Dragula, which is run by the Boulet brothers. It's probably the second biggest drag-based TV show, but has a dark gothic edge. They've already made the pun on Dracula and drag. It's a known thing with the queer community that we kind of love vampires. On the right, this is a joke, by the way. Don't go and call the Daily Mail. This is a fake flag produced for Pride based on vampires. So if vampires were part of the LGBT community, maybe this would be their flag. But it shows how closely ingrained they are. So if I get you to picture a vampire, a classic vampire, there's different forms. There's Buffy the Vampire Slayer. There's all kinds, but the classical vampire that we think of is probably Count Dracula, something like the image below. I would argue that Dracula and all of those different myths that have been spawned by him has a father and a mother, a folkloric father and a mother, and both of them are deeply queer. So let's start with the father. Okay, who is the father of the modern vampire? I would argue it's kind of two men mixed together because we're getting queer here. So it's Lord Byron, who's on the right, and it's John Polidori, who's on the left. So Polidori on the left there was the personal surgeon and physician for Lord Byron. He would travel with him and doctor to him, basically. Byron was wealthy enough to have his own personal doctor. Polidori was young and he wanted to be a writer. He wanted to be an aesthete, just like Byron, which is probably one of the reasons he connected with him. Now, Byron, if you've not heard of him before, Lord Byron was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. He was famous. He was kind of almost like the Kim Kardashian of his day. People loved to write about him. People loved to hate him. He was believed to be vain, very handsome, hypersexual, rebellious, did all kinds of political things that really upset the British at the time, and the origin of kind of the romantic movement in some senses. He was also bisexual, as we know from all of the men and women whose lives he kind of partially destroyed. This is not necessarily someone to look up to. He's a fascinating character, all the same. But the relationship between these two births the vampire mythos as we know it today. Vampires have existed since the dawn of time, all right, since dawn of humanity. But there's this incredible evening where Lord Byron, Polidori, Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, and a few others get together and they decide to write each to write a horror story. It's where Mary Shelley, and we'll come to her later, starts writing Frankenstein. And Byron starts writing a piece called A Fragment. It's about a wealthy, kind of vampiric like creature, but he doesn't finish it. And he leaves it. Now, Polidori, his kind of love-struck, jilted acolyte, basically takes this and tries to finish it off, probably to impress Byron. Like, look, I've taken your story and I finished it for you. Sadly, their relationship goes really sour. So we know that they basically end up hating each other. And the story that Polidori ends up finishing reflects this. So he writes the vampire. Not as a hideous undead zombie, as they often were before, or a demon or a creature. The vampire in his story, a vampire or the vampire, is well dressed. He's wealthy. He walks into a party and he's bored by everything. People keep inviting him places because he's so fashionable, just like Lord Byron. So he casts Lord Byron as the vampire, thus creating this symbol of the romantic, well-dressed, pomaded vampire with, exotic sensibilities. And this symbol was then, sadly, the story was then attributed to Lord Byron, even though it wasn't written by him, and may even have contributed tragically to Polidori taking his own life because there was no fame or prestige that he could get from it. In fact, Byron didn't want to be associated with this story because it was insulting. But the story was out, and the story was read by a certain Bram Stoker. And Bram Stoker, inspired by this and other things as well, many other things, trips to Whitby, created the story that we know of as Dracula. And Bram Stoker is a fascinating character I could speak to you about for 5 hours. I mean, this is a man who was married to a woman who often spoke very openly about how there were far too many, quote, sodomites in Gothic literature, despite writing things like this to the gay poet Walt Whitman. So I find this incredibly powerful. So he says, if you are the man I take you to be, you will like to get this you will like to get this letter. If you are not, I don't care whether you like it or not, and only ask that you put it in the fire without reading any further. And I'll skip ahead. He says that he likes the fact about Walt Whitman, a man living in an atmosphere prejudiced to the truths you sing and your manner of singing them. What truths might those be? Written by political gay poet Walt Whitman. So Bram is a complex man. I mean, almost certainly either bisexual or a press gay man. But he then produces arguably the most famous vampire story of all time, at least today, which is Dracula. So what about the mother? Got the father. Well, the mother's much older. Female vampires, succubi, beings of femininity that suck the life essence out of men and often babies, go all the way back to ancient Greece and longer than that. But the vampire as a concept probably starts with the idea of Lilith. So around Jewish folklore surrounding the biblical stories. So not actually in the Torah, but in the story surrounding this, describe that before Eve in the Garden of Eden, we have Lilith, the first wife of Adam. And Lilith refuses to lie for Adam. She refuses to basically have sex with him and is rejected and kicked out of Eden, thus transformed into a vampire. And some have argued the mother of all vampires, being Lilith, the first wife of Eve. And in this German woodcut, you can see Lilith coming back into the garden where she offers, in the form of a serpent-like creature, she offers the apple to Eve in a moment of temptation. So there's a sapphic or lesbian undertone to that kind of sexuality. So we end up with this idea of like vampire women being these sexually inverted beings that refuse to do what they should. And we get whole slews of stories. So we get Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, where we have, ostensibly a lesbian vampire. And this is long before Dracula, by the way. Then we have the stories like Coleridge, who writes about Lady Geraldine, a mysterious being who can't step by churches, hates the light, and slowly sucks the life away from her female prey. So the sapphic, the lesbian vampire, the woman that has an obsession with a younger woman and has vampiric tendencies is solidified, arguably long before we start to get Dracula. And even once we have Dracula, this idea continues. So Dracula's been made into many films, but one of the most popular sequels was called Dracula's Daughter. And in Dracula's daughter, Maria, who is, Count Dracula's literal daughter, is a lesbian sapphic vampire preying on the poor Lily. Interesting that she's called Lily, like Lilith, isn't it? Or Lilith. And this is partly due to what was going on at the time with repression in cinema. So we have the Hays Code in America, which meant that depicting uh, homosexuality or trans adjacent identities in film, you had to make them the bad guy, right? That's the only way. You could never promote it. So whenever filmmakers want to have a queer or gender bending subtext, it always ends up being the monster or the villain. So if you're wondering why Disney villains to this day are also camp, there's possibly one of your answers. But in this film, and I think this is quite wonderful, they had to send almost an apology because the original text was so clearly lesbian, it was so clearly gay, that they had to do rewrites to make it seem less perverse. I say. So, for example, it was stated that the present incomplete scenes will be followed by a scene in which Lily is taken to a hospital, and there will be definitely established that she's been attacked by a vampire. The whole sequence will be treated in such a way as to avoid any suggestion of perverse sexual desires on the part of Maria or of a attempted sexual attack upon her upon Lily. Too late, too little, too late. The film is so gay. It's so gay. There is this lesbian vampire camping around, preying upon a young woman. Um, and then, of course, we have, again, with mermaids, we have an HIV connection. We have another HIV connection here with the idea that our blood, so particularly gay and bisexual men as well as trans women, our blood was often seen to be polluted and dirty. You don't want to have our blood, you don't want to mix our blood. And also the fear that we passed our illness, whether that be HIV or our sexuality, through an embrace. You still hear it sometimes today. Queer people can't reproduce. We can, I've got two little boys, but we can't reproduce. So we have to indoctrinate from the young. So our blood becomes a symbol like the vampire. We come out at night like the vampire. We live very secret lives like a vampire or like a werewolf or like so many of these other creatures that we start to get. So vampire erotica, vampire queer coded films are so rich, it's actually quite difficult to make a vampire film that isn't gay. You can try. You could be a straight director trying to make the straightest vampire film in the world. And it's the creators, the story, the connections is so queer that it will still read that way a little bit unless you're really bad at what you're doing. So yeah, the kind of these tropes are played by queer people. We love our vampire erotica. They're played for, sometimes lesbian vampires are there to be fetishized by straight men, but at the same time, the theme contained there continues. Jumping now onto aliens. So we'll start like a little bit with David Bowie as an encapsulation of this theme. David Bowie, who was fabulously gender bending. I mean, in every interview, he described himself differently. So sometimes he said he was gay, bisexual, straight. You couldn't nail him down. I even struggle to call him queer. I don't think he wanted to be anything or everything, but we can guarantee the one thing that David Bowie wasn't was entirely cisgender and heterosexual in his presentation, in his performance, in his identity, in the way he spoke and acted. But he loved this alien aesthetic in the films that he appeared in, but also in the characters he assumed in the likes of Ziggy Stardust. But this has been going on for like an incredibly long time. So we're going to go back again hundreds of years to the likes of Edward Carpenter. So he here is using the idea of basically that people coming from other worlds or other planets might be tied to homosexuality. So it was popular at this time to use the term Uranus or Uranian. No jokes. All right, the joke wasn't being made then, related to the Greek god Uranus and the idea that there were two different origins, and one of them may have been without the act of a woman. And so you have thy woman soul within a man's form dwelling. Was Adam perchance like this? Ere Eve from his side was drawn, so gentle, gracious, dignified, complete. This is a poem about gay and bisexual men, and it implies that we are not of this world, that queer people are connected to another planet, another world. And this idea happens again and again if we go back to ancient history. So aliens have been around. Okay, I'm not about to go full Netflix conspiracy theory on you. The folkloric idea of aliens has been around since the dawn of time. Beings from other worlds and planets, right? You can even connect them to gods and things. But even literal creatures living on other rocky worlds have been described as far back as ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So Lucian of Samosata wrote an incredible piece called A True Story. It's a bit like Gulliver's Travels. It's this crazy story. And arguably, it's one of the first written depictions of like a real alien, however you want to define that. And this first real alien are a group of hunky men, and they live on the moon, and there are no women. They don't even know what a woman is. They reproduce with each other, they marry each other, and they give birth through their legs. And Lucian, who's inserted himself into the story, comes across these men and basically is offered one of their hunky sons in marriage, which he rejects kindly after helping them. So arguably the first aliens were gay. I don't know. You're welcome to read it that way. It's fascinating that alien beings and creatures, and we could go on to this for hours, are often depicted as having bodies and sexualities that today are very, very queer and were understood to some degree by creators of the time as being vessels to explore human sexuality and human gender beyond the accepted means. Many creators and authors did that. So, robots. All right, you may also think robots are incredibly modern. Well, yes, the ones made of metal and silicon are very much, pretty much a 20th century creation. But robotic entities, beings that are automatons, machines that are alive, they've been going around for a very, very long time. Ancient Greece, again, Hephaestus created beings that were machine-like but also had mind. There are, the golems of Jewish tradition, beings that are given a spell that gives them life. And yes, there are queer codings here from C3PO's gay butler persona. That voice, right? It's read as camp for a reason. That's humorous. Obviously, it's funny. It's for a children's film. I'm not saying that Steven Spielberg was like, I'm going to write queer subtext, but it's interesting that it is one of the only characters where we see this is in the robot. From cartoons and depictions, the idea of what would the sexuality of a robot be? Would it be asexual? There's an asexual representation there. Bjork, when she made her music video, All Is Full of Love, she created two robotic versions of herself that kissed. Sexuality in robots, again, it's been a play space for people. So we mentioned her before. Mary Shelley, who was the creator of Frankenstein. And if you're thinking, wait a second, Frankenstein's not a robot story, I would argue it definitely is. A robot made of flesh and bone, yes, but it is the archetypical robot story. Any stories today that explore androids or robots on TV, Black Mirror, anything you can imagine, the classic idea is a robot is created, a creature is created, it is given sentience, a mind, and it struggles to exist. It struggles to understand why it exists, its purpose, its meaning. And then there is always struggle and strife. And that is encapsulated in Frankenstein's monster. A being is created, in the form of the creator. It fails in some way, and then certain level of tragedy tragedy ensues as it tries to work out who it is. Now, Mary Shelley, as we saw, created this story, started the same night that The Vampire was being created in collaboration with Polidori and Byron. Um, but she was also queer. So she would not have used that term. That's me as a modern historian projecting back. But she wrote openly, particularly after her husband Percy passed away. She was devastated by that. But she wrote letters about her relationships with other women, particular women that she became completely infatuated with. And I was so ready to give myself away, and being afraid of men, I was apt to get Talcy Mousy for women. So Talcy Mousy comes from a contemporary term, a time of a word at the time called Tuzzy Muzzy, which basically referred to a woman's genitalia. So she's being jokey in this moment, and she knows what she's saying, right? This isn't someone who, she, in many ways was incredibly brazen. Um, so the next person I want to talk about briefly is Selma Lagerlof. So Selma Lagerlof arguably created, like, again, one of the archetypical robot stories. So she created this called the Slatakalana par Ekosland, the Reapers of Ekosland, which explored these robot farmers that are programmed to farm fields and then turned on their own masters. And it's a very dark look at the dangers of future technology. Now, Selma was a lesbian. We know her relationships with women. And she wrote all of these interesting, like, dark gothic fairy tales that are often saying something about the world around them, but she used robots in particular to explore, like, the dangers of the future coming from a 19th century author, what this might look like. So why would queer people find themselves creating a lot of robots? And we'll find more examples in a moment. Well, I would argue one of the things is, if you are strange and different in any way, and you're trying to fit in, and you're watching other people's body language, and you're maybe trying to make sure your wrist isn't too floppy, you're listening to how your voice is modulated, you're not too butch, you're not too feminine, you become very good at being a human observer. And the character of the robot is often a human observer. Think of Data from Star Trek trying to be human, trying to be more believable, is something that queer people get. And I wonder if that puts us in a great position to create these stories. So there's all kinds of people like Arthur C. Clarke, for example, who another gay man who created 2001: Space Odyssey. The book was created at the same time as the film. And when asked whether Hal, the evil AI, was gay, because he has this kind of slightly camp voice, and he's always observing the two men on the ship in their underwear. So there's these interesting scenes. He basically said, "Oh, I don't know. There might be a lot going underneath in the subconscious. It's mysterious, but it's clear that there was a queer subtext to that." For example, if you look at the script within the film, look, Dave, but listen to how he tries to, like, almost placate the human person that he's trying to kill. I can see you're really upset about this. I honestly think you ought to sit down calmly, take a stress pill, and think this over. I know I've made some very poor decisions recently. Is this an evil cyborg, or is this the worst ex-boyfriend you've ever had? This manipulative, gaslighting entity. There is a romantic and sexual jealousy that goes through the robot observing the real humans, and the way that he flirts with them is fascinating. So robots often have this queer vibe to them. I mean, an obvious connection to draw would be, the incredible Alan Turing, who, in terms of artificial intelligence, which I know has become a really complicated thing today, but in the past, a lot of queer folk were fascinated by AI, nerdy LGBTQ plus folk thinking about what is it to be human, and what would it take to convince a human that an AI was human. So Alan Turing, obviously famous for his work at Bletchley Park, creating computational devices. Some people call him the father of modern computing, a gay man who sadly took his own life due to persecution by the British government because of his sexuality. But also fascinated with robots and artificial intelligence and what that would mean. An outside observer looking in is able to think with the mind of a robot sometimes. And I want to tell you about someone you may never have heard of before. This is Chris Strachey. He's my new current obsession. So Strachey went to Oxford University. He was fascinated with early computing. He actually did know Alan Turing. He was a bit younger than him. He was also a violin virtuoso and he was a gay man. But he used computing in the very early days, we're talking like the 50s, to create artworks like this self-portrait created out of binary code. He also created the very first video game. You may not know that because it's often erased. You'll hear that the first video game was Pong, or it was one of those little bouncy ones on the circular screens. Well, before then, he created a version of checkers that you could play on a screen. And this, as far as we know, is the earliest quote video game. He also created an artificial love letter generator. Um, so think about how queer people who are fascinated in these worlds bring their stories into robotics, into AI, longing, love, pain, right? Distance. And that's something that has become part of the robotic or AI mythos that we still have today. Chris was a very troubled man, really struggled with his sexuality, and I think found safety. Just like Alan did, actually, in creating these research projects, these ideas where, he might be judged by other people, but a robotic AI would never judge him or would never judge the kind of love letters that he may secretly want to write. Very briefly, before we come to the end, we'll touch on witches. Witches is a whole thing. It's a great big meaty chapter in the book. But the idea of witchcraft and magic is something that is often associated with queerness. Now, witches as a symbol, as all of these symbols, they can be sprung off in many different directions. Witches are a feminist conversation. There is an idea that, those witches who were judged for being old, so there's an ageist thing. Witches who were persecuted for being ugly or disabled. Like, this is another reason any woman or person, because men could also be accused of witchcraft as well, might be persecuted for their difference. But we see within the witch this idea of forbidden sexuality. There were a number of women who were accused of witchcraft for using dildos with other women, for having relationships with other women, for having bodies that didn't conform in the way that they were supposed to, who didn't look womanly enough, and for those men who were deemed to be feminine, or those women who were deemed to be men. These were other reasons to be punished for witchcraft. I wanted to show you these two images because I think they're incredibly powerful and show how long this goes back. The one on the left is from the illustrated Bible, illuminated Bible, and it shows two men together canoodling and two women together canoodling, urged on by demons, right? So the idea that sexuality is demonic in its sense, that homosexuality comes from some evil pact with the devil. We'll come to this in one moment. It's still very much there today. And the image on the right there, which is the witches at their Sabbath, we can see, witches writhing in pleasure with each other, an old witch clutching onto the buttocks of another witch. There is this sense of predatoriness within sexuality that also ties into witchcraft. And we may think that this stuff looks really old and this is ancient, but as we've said, it permeates all the way through to today. So my final point I want to make is what you can take away from this is next time you hear people talking about gender and sexuality, the transgender issue is everywhere. It's in every headline. It's in America. It's one of the biggest talking points. Listen to the language. Does it sound like they're describing a person, a human with a mind and autonomy? Or does it sound that they're describing someone who's been possessed, someone that isn't quite human, someone that is dangerous, someone like, the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood who dresses in women's clothes so that they can eat and hurt other women? Are we still using rhetoric and language around all kinds of queer people that dates back hundreds and thousands of years? Have we actually moved on all that far? So, a few final things before we go to the Q&A. If you liked listening to me and you're interested in this kind of stuff, I have a few recommendations. A Little Gay History by R.B. Parkinson is the British Museum's LGBT history book. I know it says gay history, but it's actually across the spectrum. That's really great if you love objects and artifacts. It Came from the Closet is a wonderful book. It's a collection of essays written by queer people in response to their favorite horror films. If you want a primary primer on mermaids because mermaids is just your thing. Vaughan Scribner's written a beautiful book called Mer People, A Human History, which I love that because it's the idea that the monster is very human. The British Museum, again, they had an exhibition called The Divine and the Demonic, Feminine Power. That catalogue is wonderful, and I used it heavily in some of my research, definitely talking about queer women. If you like YouTube, I highly recommend Rowan Ellis, who really explores representation in contemporary media. They're fabulous, they're really, really good, and particularly in science fiction and fantasy. And Kaelan Conrad, who's made a lot of work looking at like queer history and the misinformation around the likes of Stonewall and how we've diluted the real story. So I would highly, highly recommend those as well. So without further ado, I will stop sharing, and it would be lovely if we could have a little chat. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Sasha. Take a breath. That was amazing. So we've had a few questions that have come in on the chat. So what I'm going to do is we've got about 5 minutes or so. So I'm going to pick out one of those. If in the meantime anyone wants to pop the hand up to ask a question verbally, that's fine. So had a question from Caroline in the chat, which says, do you think there might be similar queer underpinnings to modern myths like urban legend, creepypasta, cryptids, etc.?
Almost certainly, and I've described it as being a missing chapter in my book. I started writing it, and sadly, I had to cut things down a little bit. But yeah, if you look at the popularity of online, like modern kind of the great example being creepypasta. If you're wondering what the hell is creepypasta, it's basically people constructing their own monsters and myths online. It's been happening pretty much since like the late 90s. Queer folk are massively overrepresented in that audience. And there is a really dark connection if you want to go into like Slender Man. There was a really awful case recently, well, relatively recently, with someone attempted murder based on Slender Man, which has a weird queer backstory to it. When I write about queer stories, it's not always the lovely stuff. But yeah, we are tied to the modern myth making as well as the past. Yes.
Awesome, thanks. Um, so I can't see any hands up, I don't think. So I'm going to pick another question from the chat. Um, so Sally has asked, I'm going to read that. So I'm really interested in moral panics and how they collide with cultural output, e.g. Cold War, 1950s sci-fi invasion movies. Do you see any trends with folklore figures coming to the fore in step with societal shifts and panics?
Yes, and I find it really disturbing. Like after reading this, and I think I kind of finished off a little bit like this, but I can see this cyclical panic that we do. We have a sex gender panic probably every 35 years. I would say we had the satanic panic, if you've heard of that, during the 1980s, and it bled out into the 90s around Dungeons and Dragons, around people are being sacrificed to Satan, and it wasn't happening. It just wasn't happening. But there was a huge queer element to it. There's a story of a whole group of Hispanic lesbians who were sent to prison for satanic child abuse at a children's daycare that never happened. It never happened, and they were finally exonerated and released. But what I'm seeing now, the gender panic that we're having now, the language that's used, having researched fairies and demons, of my child has been taken away from me by the gender cabal. They're convincing children that they need to transform themselves. Some people have even gone as far to use the word demonic. It's happening in the right in America. This demonic attack on children. These aren't humans. And it's this dehumanizing folkloric attack that seems to it happens slightly different every 35 years, but we just can't seem to stop doing it. But I think when you know it and you can hear it, you can start to see right through it. That we're just pulling on the same threads that we seem to do every time there's an issue in society. We look for scapegoats, and obviously queer people aren't the only scapegoats, but we are one that's easy to go for.
Thanks. And I think that will connect with a lot of people in the room working in libraries and working with sort of misinformation and disinformation, particularly. So we've got one last question. On the last point that you made about Stonewall, do you have any thoughts on the sort of reverse of your research? So the mythologization and thereby sanitation of real queer histories.
So are we talking about making like queer history a little bit more clean and nice and kind
I
of
suspect so. Polishing it up and often desexualizing it, I
yeah.
think, and sanitizing it for public consumption.
It's this weird thing that happens, and I think if you're queer or you have queer friends, maybe you've seen this happen that society does at the same time is it hypersexualizes us and then it neuters us at the same time. So on one hand, I've had conversations with people, with some right-wing folk who, when they talk about me being gay, the only thing they seem to be able to think about is sex. Whereas actually, my sexuality, I know it may seem like, oh, I'm attracted to men, that's the main thing. No, my being gay is so much more about community and growing up and what that was like and difference and the kind of culture I move in and the words I use. It's a much more complex thing than what happens in my bedroom, right? And that level can be like really hypersexual. You see a trans person and you instantly presume there's a perversion on display rather than there's just someone going shopping in Tesco's. And then the flip side of that, though, is like that we're very uncomfortable with seeing certain things. So, explicit or kind of, and I say explicit, no more so than the kind of heterosexual unions that we would see on TV. We're still very, very uncomfortable with seeing kind of same-sex unions to the same degree. And if we do, they're, little kisses on the lips. So, not to call certain things out, because some things are wonderful and beautiful, and I think really empowering for people. But the likes of Heartstopper, for a very long time, those teenage boys had one of the most monastic relationships I've ever heard of. I've never known of two teenagers that are really into each other going so slowly and being so like chaste because there is a sense of fearing that if we are our real selves that could be horrifying. There is a sense of the desire to put the best foot forward and constantly presenting ourselves as acceptable because we want to be invited to the party. But there is also a sense of like, it wouldn't it be nice if we could be our whole selves as well? It's a really complicated one. I do think it is getting better. I really do. I think some elements in society and politics are getting really bad right now. We're at a real like, crunch point. But culturally, in terms of art and the things that you can consume in books and TV, I think things are better than they've ever been before.
Thank you so much. And that's a really nice point on which to end, I think. So thank you so much, Sacha. That was a fantastic presentation. If you get a chance to look back through the chat, you'll see that everybody was absolutely loving it. We're going to end the session here. So if anyone wants to sort of add their thanks into the chat for Sacha, we're going to be back at a timetable at 2:30, and at that point we've got parallel sessions so you can pick which sessions you are going to go to. But thank you very much, Sacha. Thank you everyone for your questions and for your engagement in the chat, and we'll see you all in about 13 minutes. Thank you very much. Okay, bye everyone.